For my next lecture, I decided to do Chapter 5, Eukaryotic Cells and Microorganisms. We'll start off talking about eukaryotic cells. These types of cells contain a nucleus, and these are typically your animal, plant, and fungi cells. Bacteria and archaea are two major groups of the eukaryotic cells. These types of cells have a nuclear membrane that sort of cover the whole cell. Now we're going to talk about unicellular and multicellular structures. So with unicellular, these are single-celled microorganisms. These have defined nucleuses, mitochondria, and other organelles. And then multicellular, these are the organisms that contain a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. For this slide, I wanted to put some examples up. So with unicellular, you can think of plankton and phytoplankton, algae, protozoa, and yeast. For multicellular, you'll think of animals, plants, fungi, cells, and protists. Next, we'll talk about endosymbiosis. So this is a theory that they came up with to explain how the first chloroplasts and mitochondria were made. So they say that a prokaryotic cell entered an ancestral eukaryotic cell, therefore they come up with this endosymbiosis. This is actually when one organism lives inside of another, but they're not always in a mutualistic relationship. Some examples of this are single-cell algae in coral and nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the roots of legumes. Next, we'll talk about the flagellar structures of bacteria, archaea, and eukaryote. Flagellum is the little tiny, they kind of look like legs, they come off of the cells and they help them with motility, which means it helps them kind of move around and swim around. So bacteria, their flagellum rotate independently, so they're on their own. But in archaea, they rotate as a single assembly, which means they all rotate at the same time, the same movement. When it comes to eukaryotes, you'll find their flagellum on the surface of that cell. This slide, I kind of just put some pictures up just so you can kind of see the flagellum. As I described, they're like tiny legs or little fillers on the ends of these cells. Now we're going to talk about the components of a nucleus. We'll go in more depth on this in the next slide. But you have a nuclear envelope, a nuclear lamina, a nucleolus, chromosomes, and the nucleoplasm. So we'll start with the nuclear envelope. This is the thing that separates the nucleus from the cytoplasm. It keeps the contents in the nucleus and then the cytoplasm out. It also provides the structural framework of the nucleus. Then you have the nuclear lamina. This plays a critical role in maintaining that nuclear shape, and it also helps regulate gene expression through the chromatin interactions. Next, we'll talk about the nucleolus. Now, this is a very important part of the cell because it contains all of the cell's chromosomes. These chromosomes are so important because they carry the long pieces of DNA. The chromosomes are the building block of the human body. They're what make us us. Then you have that nucleoplasm, which holds all that genetic material in that cell. Next, we'll talk about the transport process of proteins. This includes the nucleus, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the transport vesicles, the Golgi complex, and the cell membrane. So with this, ribosomes are going to assemble the proteins that enter the rough ER. Those proteins then will move through the ER, being further modified. After that, they're pinched off from the rough ER, and then the vesicles will fuse with the Golgi complex and it will release those proteins inside of there. Inside of there, those proteins are processed and stored. Once that's finished, they are then pinched off from the Golgi complex, where the vesicles will take them to the cell membrane where they will fuse and release the proteins outside of that cell. So next we'll talk about some ribosomes. These are found in all cells. They link amino acids together, and they consist of small and large ribosomal subunits. So when you look at the endoplasmic reticulum, that rough ER, the little dots on there, those are your ribosomes. Next, we'll talk about the mitochondria. And this is where the energy production occurs. This is the powerhouse of the cell. It uses aerobic respiration to help generate that ATP, which is the energy for the cell. And you can see this orange part in the picture, that is actually the mitochondria. Next, we'll talk about the 3 different cytoskeleton fibers. So you have microfilament, intermediate, and microtubule. That microfilament is actually 2 intertwined strands of a globular protein that is actually called actin. And then that intermediate fiber, it kind of helps organize the internal structure of the cell. And then the microtubule fibers, they kind of continue to assemble and disassemble things in the cell. Next, we'll talk about the activities of fungi. So fungi actually has beneficial and detrimental activities. Detrimental is it spoils food, we know that. It can destroy timber, and it's very bad for farmers because it can cause diseases in their crops or their livestock. And fungi can actually cause diseases in us humans. Some beneficial things of fungi is that it helps decompose dead plants and dead animals, and it'll cycle those nutrients and increase their availability in the soil. And next we'll talk about helminths. There are multiple types of helminths. I chose roundworms and flatworms. So roundworms are actually called nematodes, and they are found in the intestine of animals, and they are very parasitic. Flatworms are called platyhelminths. They're found on surfaces and undersides of rocks and flowing water, and they are very parasitic. An example of a flatworm would be a tapeworm.